They came to my door at sunrise, 3 men in tactical vests armed with clipboards, and fake authority claiming my own HOA had the power to take my son away. Behind them, Karen stood in her yard smirking like she'd already won. But what they didn't know was this. I'm not the kind of father who folds under threats. I've fought wars, buried ghosts, and carried scars they can't imagine. And if they thought they could steal my son in the name of compliance, they just signed their own surrender. The knock on my door wasn't the kind you ignore. It wasn't a neighbor dropping by to borrow sugar or a delivery guy with a box he could barely carry. No, this was 3 flat-palmed thuds that rattled my window glass and sent a cold echo down the hallway. It was the kind of knock that carried weight, the kind of knock that tells you whoever is on the other side isn't there to chat. I hadn't even finished my first cup of coffee when it started, and by the 3rd knock I knew something was wrong. I moved slowly to the door, not because I was afraid, but because every instinct in me, the kind honed by years of Green Beret service, was screaming to evaluate, assess, anticipate. Through the peephole, I saw them. 3 men, broad-shouldered, dressed head to toe in matte black tactical vests, reinforced boots, and knockoff comms clipped to their collars. They looked like a discount SWAT team hired from Craigslist. Behind them, a black SUV sat idling with its headlights, still on a faint rumble filling the early morning silence. And then I saw her. Across the street, leaning casually on her garden rake, sipping something from a stainless steel tumbler, was Karen, my neighbor, the woman who thought she was the queen of our neighborhood HOA. She wasn't blinking. She wasn't looking at her roses. She was looking at me smiling, as though she had orchestrated the whole performance. My stomach dropped, because I knew if she was involved, this was more than just a random scare tactic. I opened the door slowly, keeping my body angled. The tallest of the 3 men stepped forward like he had rehearsed this moment in front of his bathroom mirror a dozen times. His hair was buzzed, short sunglasses still on despite the dawn light, and he carried himself with the smugness of a man who thought a clipboard gave him authority. "Mr. Walker," he said, glancing at his clipboard as though it contained state secrets. "We're here for a scheduled compliance review under HOA custody ordinance." I let the words hang in the air. Compliance review. Custody ordinance. Nonsense dressed in legal language. I had spent years reading actual government directives, actual classified orders. This was word salad meant to intimidate. "Come again," I said finally, my tone flat. He didn't flinch. "Under Article 4, 7C, the HOA retains the right to conduct minor safety compliance evaluations if a resident has been flagged as high risk. We've received a concern regarding your son's living conditions." My jaw clenched. He hadn't looked me in the eye when he said it. He was looking over my shoulder, scanning past me into the house toward the hallway that led upstairs, toward my son's room. I stepped forward, closing the door behind me with a firm click, making sure there was no open path into my home. "You just said a lot of words," I told him. None of them made sense. The 2nd man, stockier and built like a nightclub bouncer, crossed his arms tighter. The 3rd, younger and lankier, kept shifting his weight nervously like he was new to this kind of intimidation act. Their formation was practiced but sloppy, just enough to fool someone who had never seen real military precision. The leader, Buzzcut, I'll call him, flipped another page on his clipboard. "We're here to evaluate Jason Walker's living environment. Non-cooperation will be logged." He spoke like he was issuing a parking ticket. From across the street, Karen waved. Her smile widened. She mouthed the words, "It's for the best." And that's when my hands curled into fists. The young enforcer cleared his throat. "We can escalate this through proper channels, but our recommendation was to start with a non-invasive approach." "Non-invasive," I barked a laugh, stepping off the porch. 3 guys in tactical vests banging on my door at sunrise is non-invasive. Buzzcut's jaw tightened. "Are you refusing inspection?" I let the silence stretch. I didn't nod. I didn't shake my head. I just adjusted my posture, shifting my feet shoulder-width apart, hands loose at my sides, head tilted. It was subtle, but Buzzcut noticed. His eyes flickered for a split second because he realized what I had just done. I had closed the distance, measured my angles, and prepared for a takedown. If he made one wrong move, he'd be on the ground before his clipboard hit the porch. The silence dragged like a taut wire. My coffee was cooling on the counter inside, but the only thing heating me up now was anger. Karen didn't blink. She just kept filming with her phone, sipping her drink like this was her morning entertainment. Finally, Buzzcut spoke again, his voice clipped. "We'll report non-cooperation and initiate Phase 2. Thank you for your time." The 3 of them turned in unison, walking back toward the SUV. Not rushed, not panicked, just methodical, like this wasn't the first time they had rehearsed such an exit. The SUV door opened, they climbed in, and just like that, they were gone. But not without leaving something behind. I stepped forward my boot, nudging a folded piece of paper on the ground. It wasn't dropped by accident, it was placed. I bent down and picked it up. My son's name, Jason Walker, printed clearly at the top, below it a date. And in large blocky red letters, Phase 2 approved. I felt the air leave my chest. My fists tightened around the paper until it crumpled. Across the street, Karen finally turned her back, sauntering toward her roses as if nothing had happened. As if she hadn't just watched 3 men threaten to take my son. Behind me, I heard the soft creak of the floorboards inside. Jason stood halfway down the stairs, barefoot, still in pajamas. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. His wide eyes and shallow breathing told me he'd heard everything. "You okay, buddy?" I asked, forcing my voice steady. He nodded once, lips pressed tight. No words came out. And that's when it hit me like a freight train. This wasn't about lawn maintenance or HOA rules. This was about control. They weren't bluffing. They weren't playing neighborhood politics. They were staging a war, and my son was their target. The next morning, the neighborhood looked deceptively calm. Sprinklers ticked in perfect arcs across green lawns, dogs barked at passing cars, and Karen knelt by her flower bed as if she hadn't orchestrated a paramilitary doorstep ambush 12 hours earlier. But when I stepped onto my porch, I found another message taped to the front door. Not slipped into the mailbox, not tucked under the welcome mat, taped right across the wood like a scarlet letter. I peeled it off carefully. Violation notice, visual disruption. The listed offense, Jason's bicycle left on the lawn for 2 hours after school. The fine, $75. At first glance, it was laughable. But at the bottom, in faint gray print, was a line that chilled me. Persistent visual disruption may trigger compliance monitoring per Article 4.7c. They weren't just fining us, they were building a case. Piece by piece, citation by citation, they were trying to paint a picture of neglect, a paper trail designed to justify whatever came next, Phase 2, whatever that meant. I carried the notice into the kitchen. Jason was at the table stirring cereal like it had wronged him. Sarah sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the wall, lips pressed tight. No one said a word until I laid the notice flat on the counter. Jason glanced at it then, at me. "I didn't do anything," he muttered. His voice wasn't defensive. It was fragile, like he was pleading with me to believe him. "You don't have to explain," I said softly. But the truth was, his words stabbed deeper than I wanted to admit. Because that's exactly what the HOA wanted for Jason to start doubting himself, to think he was the problem. That's when the front door opened without a knock. Morning Sunshine Nate, my old friend, strode in with 2 energy drinks in one hand and a flash drive in the other. He looked like he'd spent the entire night hunched over a laptop. His hoodie was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, and yet he had the kind of grin that said he'd just uncovered something worth the exhaustion. "I did a thing," he announced before I could even ask. "Technically legal, maybe not. Morally questionable. Sure. Necessary, absolutely." He dropped into a chair, spun his laptop around, and plugged in the flash drive. On the screen appeared a folder labeled Project Haven, Willow Ridge Subdivision. "Where the hell did you get this?" I asked, my voice low but sharp. "Your Wi-Fi is terrible," Nate said, ignoring the question. "But Karen's not so much. Her system is practically an open door. I just walked through it." He clicked open the folder. Inside were spreadsheets, photographs, time-stamped surveillance reports, 32 families in the neighborhood, each with a file. Each flagged for risk factors. My stomach twisted as I read the categories. Single-parent households, veterans with combat history, children with disciplinary notes at school, residents who missed HOA dues. It wasn't about neighborhood upkeep. It was profiling, systematic, intentional profiling. Then I saw it. My name, Jason's name. Walker Jason Minor, 714B, stability monitoring required. Walker Daniel Guardian, volatile risk. Prior military trauma. Surveillance authorized. A still photo showed Jason leaving school, backpack slung over one shoulder. Another grainier showed me pacing the driveway at night. And then one that froze my blood-cold Jason in our backyard, outlined in red. Jason leaned over the table, his small hands gripping the edge as his eyes locked onto the screen. "They think I'm not safe here," he whispered. I wanted to tell him it wasn't true. I wanted to tell him the system was wrong. But I couldn't get the words out. Because staring at the cold digital text, I realized something awful. They didn't just think Jason was unsafe. They thought I was the danger. Sarah broke the silence, her voice trembling but firm. This isn't just an HOA anymore, is it? I shook my head slowly. Number. This is bigger. This is organized. Nate tapped furiously on the keyboard, pulling up more files. Look at this safe start. That's the program name. Funded under something called the Family Oversight Division. They're building pre-clearance cases. That means they don't wait for a crime or neglect. They build a narrative in advance, and when the file is thick enough, they act. Karen's face flashed in my mind, her smug smile, her calm wave, her whispered words, "It's for the best." So she's feeding them, I muttered. Actively, Nate confirmed. Her reports match the timestamps. She's their eyes, their informant. I stood pacing the kitchen. My pulse hammered in my ears. I'd fought insurgents overseas who used children as shields, who twisted rules and exploited fear. But I never imagined I'd come home to face the same tactics dressed up as neighborhood policy. Jason finally broke the silence. His voice was small, but his words carried weight. "They're going to take me away, aren't they?" I stopped pacing, knelt beside him, and looked him in the eye. "Not while I'm breathing," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, a part of me wondered if I could keep that promise. Because now it wasn't just Karen's power trip. It was a system, a machine, and it had already marked us for removal. From the corner of my eye, I saw Sarah's jaw tighten. She wasn't angry at me. She was afraid. Not of the HOA. Not of Karen. Afraid of the man sitting across from her husband, the man she married years ago who had come back from war carrying shadows he never spoke of, and now those shadows were being used as weapons against us. I leaned back against the counter, folded the violation notice in half, and forced myself to breathe evenly. Because one thing was certain, this wasn't going to stop with fines or warnings. Phase 2 was coming. And when it did, I had to be ready. Karen's roses were always too perfect. Not a petal out of place, not a leaf with so much as a brown edge. She trimmed them like she was pruning lives, not plants, every snip deliberate, every thorn placed just so. That's where I found her the next afternoon, clippers in one hand, phone in the other, sunlight bouncing off her pearl earrings. She didn't look surprised when I walked up. If anything, she looked like she'd been waiting. "Daniel," she said sweetly, her voice carrying the kind of false warmth that made my skin crawl. "Did you see the newsletter? HOA is bringing back pickleball nights. It's such a healthy activity for families." I didn't answer her small talk. My hands itched to crush the folder she had tucked under her arm, but I forced myself calm. "You're flagging my son. You're filing photos. You're feeding them." She tilted her head, smiling as though she'd just been complimented. "I don't flag anyone. The system does. I simply observe patterns." "Patterns," I snapped. "Jason leaves his bike on the lawn, and you call it neglect. You call it dangerous." Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "It's not about the bike. It's about risk. And children need safe environments." That was when she slipped the envelope out of her folder and held it toward me like a poisoned gift. White official-looking, no return address. A government seal stamped in the corner. Family Oversight Division. "This came to my house by mistake," she said casually. "I thought you'd want it." I didn't take it right away. My pulse hammered, my vision narrowing on the emblem. I'd seen seals like that before during deployments when shadow programs were disguised as humanitarian aid, bureaucracy hiding teeth. "What's inside?" I asked. She shrugged, sipping her lemonade like this was a lazy Sunday. "I didn't open it. That would be a violation. But I can guess. A compliance review. Maybe even an evaluation order." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Daniel, you're spiraling. Jason doesn't need chaos. He needs stability. Maybe it's time you considered stepping aside for his sake." Her words hit harder than a punch. Not because I believed them, but because she delivered them like she was offering casserole to a sick neighbor, kind, sympathetic, rehearsed, weaponized concern. I finally snatched the envelope from her hand. The weight of it felt heavier than paper should. My thumb traced the seal. She watched me with satisfaction, like she had just fed the system another bite of our lives. "You think you're protecting this neighborhood," I said slowly. "But all you're doing is feeding a machine that doesn't care about roses or bikes or families. You're giving it people to chew up." Her smile never wavered. "I am the one watching. That's the point." For a long second, I just stared at her, the afternoon heat pressing down like a lead blanket. In her eyes, I didn't see malice. I saw something worse: conviction. She believed every word, and that made her more dangerous than any mercenary. When I finally turned back toward my house, envelope clenched in my fist, Jason was standing at the window. His face pale, his eyes locked on me, watching every move. I forced a smile, though my stomach churned. He didn't smile back. Inside, Sarah was waiting. She saw the envelope before I said a word. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tight. "Trouble," I said simply. I set it on the counter, but I didn't open it yet. Because some things you need to prepare for, even if it's just paper. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside felt like a threat. I sat by the window staring at the envelope on the table, imagining the words it contained. Custody review, evaluation order, transfer approval. My mind spun with possibilities, each one worse than the last. At 2 a.m., I finally tore it open. Inside was a single page. At the top, Safe Start Initiative, Family Oversight Division. Below it, bold black letters, Guardian Stability Assessment scheduled. My name was listed. So was Jason's Poplus. And beneath it, in smaller print, one chilling phrase, Phase 2 activation pending. I sat frozen, the words burning into my brain. They weren't bluffing. This wasn't HOA theater anymore. This was sanctioned. Or at least it wore the costume of sanction. I thought about confronting Karen again, ripping her roses out by the roots. But anger wouldn't help Jason. What he needed was protection, and protection meant strategy. The next morning, Nate came back. His laptop was still open from the night before, lines of code streaming like a war chant. I dug deeper, he said. This Safe Start program, it's not just our HOA. There are files on at least a dozen neighborhoods, maybe more. They're calling them pilot programs, test beds. Test beds for what I asked, though. I already knew the answer. Nate turned the screen toward me. It showed charts, behavioral models, compliance scores, predictive simulations, families reduced to numbers, children reduced to risk factors. Jason's name glared at me from the top of the list, marked in red. They're not just watching, Nate said grimly. They're experimenting. They want to see how far they can push before families break. I clenched my fists, the paper notice still crumpled in my palm. Then they picked the wrong family. But even as I said it, a voice inside whispered the truth. Maybe that was exactly why they picked us. That night, I found myself on the porch again, watching the quiet street. The black SUV hadn't returned, but I knew it would. Karen's porch light glowed across the road, steady and unblinking, like an eye that never slept. And in my chest, the rage I'd kept caged for years began to stir. Because if Phase 2 was coming, I would be ready. But they had no idea what Phase 2 looked like when a Green Beret was the one writing it. The night they came for Jason, the air was heavy, thick, with the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. No cicadas, no barking dogs, not even the hum of sprinklers that usually switched on at midnight. It felt manufactured, as if the entire neighborhood had been muted. I was in the living room reading through Nate's files again when I heard the sound. A faint scrape metal against wood. My body reacted before my mind did. I was on my feet, moving toward the back door in silence, years of training flowing back like muscle memory. That's when I saw it, the back door latch slowly turning. In one violent motion, the door flew open, and two men in tactical gear slipped inside, dragging Jason by the collar. His feet scraped the floor, pajamas twisted, eyes wide with terror, but fists clenched, fighting like hell. Target secured, one of them hissed into his comm. My blood went cold. No hesitation. I moved. I hit the first man mid-sprint shoulder, driving into his ribs. The impact sent him crashing into the wall drywall, shattering like brittle glass. Jason tumbled free, scrambling across the floor. The second man spun toward me, knife flashing in his hand. I grabbed the nearest thing within reach, a chair, and kicked it into his legs. He stumbled, and I tackled him over the table. The crash sent silverware clattering to the tile floor. He slashed wild, grazing my arm, hot blood seeping through my sleeve. I barely felt it. Jason screamed, "Dad," that single word pulled me sharper than any pain could. I slammed my elbow into the attacker's jaw, then smashed the coffee pot across his face. Glass exploded. He crumpled, blood mixing with spilled coffee across the linoleum. The first man staggered back to his feet, gasping, his comm still buzzing. I lunged, grabbed him by the collar, and drove him headfirst into the refrigerator. The sound was sickening. His body sagged, sliding down to the floor in a heap. But then came the third. Bigger than the others, calmer, stepping through the hallway like he owned the place. His presence was different, efficient, deliberate. This wasn't a hired thug. This was someone trained. He didn't shout, didn't posture. He advanced like finishing fights was his specialty. He threw the first punch hard and precise, straight into my ribs. I staggered, breath exploding from my lungs. He followed with another, but I countered with a headbutt. Pain lit up my skull, but he stumbled back half a step, enough for me to see it. On his chest rig, laminated in plastic, was a photograph. Jason's face. My son tagged like prey. Something inside me snapped. I roared, grabbed him by the collar and drove him through the drywall. The house shuddered with the impact. Jason screamed my name. Sarah's footsteps thundered down the stairs, but I didn't stop. One punch. Two. Three. Blood spattered across my knuckles. He gasped, body twitching, but my fists kept falling. Then I caught myself. The man was down, barely breathing. My chest heaved. My hands dripped red. And Jason was standing there pressed against Sarah, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. Not the eyes of a son looking at his protector, the eyes of a boy seeing a stranger. I forced myself to stop, to breathe, to stand. My knuckles screamed in pain, but I shoved the rage back into its cage. Not for me, but for him. I grabbed a zip tie from the counter, an old habit from deployments, keeping restraints close, and bound the man's wrists. The other two were unconscious, one twitching, the other motionless. I didn't check their pulses. I didn't care. Instead, I yanked the phone off the third man's belt. Locked. I pressed his bloody finger to the sensor. It clicked open. Inside was a schedule. Extraction 0300 AM. Asset 714B secured. Guardian interference probable. My stomach twisted. They had planned for me. They expected me to resist. Sarah was pale, clutching Jason to her chest. Daniel, what is happening? I couldn't answer. Not yet. My throat was tight with rage, fear, guilt. Then the sirens came. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows, painting the ruined kitchen in strobing colors. 2 squad cars, 1 unmarked cruiser doors, slamming radios crackling. Officers poured into the yard. Step away from them, one shouted through the front door. I raised my hands, slowly backing up. They broke in. They tried to abduct my son. The tallest officer scanned the room, his eyes moving from Jason to the 3 bodies, then to me. His hand hovered near his weapon. Another officer darted to the SUV idling outside, yanked the door, and froze. 30 seconds later, he returned pale as chalk. There's a manifest, he said quietly. GPS routes, labels, Safe Start logo stamped on every page. Jason looked from him to me. His voice shook. So they really were going to take me. The officer didn't answer. He didn't need to. And then, like a director calling cut, Karen appeared. She was standing on her lawn bathrobe, perfectly pressed phone raised high, recording everything. Her smirk was gone now, replaced by a calm, practiced expression. You always make things worse, Daniel, she called, her voice carrying across the chaos. This could have been a peaceful resolution. I turned slowly, every muscle in my body begging to lunge at her. You ordered this. She didn't blink. I recommended escalation. They acted independently. Jason broke free from Sarah's arms, his voice cracking as he shouted, You think this is protecting me? You don't know what he's done to keep me safe. Karen's eyes softened like she was the caring aunt, the voice of reason. Jason, sometimes safety means separation. That was the moment Jason snapped. He pointed straight at her voice, breaking but loud enough for every cop to hear. She sent people to take me. You all saw it. The silence was a knife. The officers exchanged glances. The weight shifted. And for the first time, Karen's face flickered. One of the officers stepped forward. Detain the men. Secure the evidence. Karen just smiled faintly, lowering her phone. You're not well, Daniel. That's what worries me most. Her words burned into me even as they dragged the men outside. Because I knew something now, this wasn't Karen's operation. She was a pawn. A dangerous pawn, yes, but still just a piece on a much larger board. And if tonight was phase 2, then phase 3 was already waiting in the shadows. Sleep didn't come that night. Not for me, not for Sarah, and certainly not for Jason. We sat in silence around the dining table, long after the police left the house, still scarred from the fight. Shards of glass glittered on the floor, bloodstains smeared across the counter drywall, dust coating the air. The smell of burned coffee lingered like a bad omen. Jason wouldn't look at me. He kept staring at his hands, clenching and unclenching his fists, as if testing whether they still belonged to him. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was brittle. They didn't arrest you. Why, I rubbed my temples. Because they saw enough to know it wasn't a hallucination. That manifest was real. But don't think for a second they're on our side. The best I'll get is a delay, Jason whispered. A delay for what I didn't answer. The words stuck in my throat. Because the truth was too ugly, they weren't stopping. They were regrouping. When Jason finally shuffled off to bed, Sarah stayed behind. She leaned against the counter, arms folded, eyes sharp. They're building a case against you, she said flatly. Those files Nate found unstable, veteran, volatile risk. They're going to use your past against you. Her words opened wounds I'd spent years stitching closed. Memories surged back, uninvited: the dust of Fallujah, the choking smoke of a warehouse raid gone wrong, the sound of a child screaming in a language I didn't understand. I closed my eyes, but it didn't help. The scene replayed like it always did. We breached the building, expecting weapons stockpiles. Instead, chaos erupted: bullets, shouts, ricochets. In the confusion, I saw her, a girl no more than 9, crouched in the corner, with tears streaking down her face. She wasn't armed. She wasn't part of the fight. She was just there. For 1 second, I froze. My training screamed to act, to move, to protect. But in that heartbeat of hesitation, she bolted, ran straight into the open. I could have grabbed her, shielded her, dragged her to cover, but my feet felt welded to the ground. I saw Jason's face in hers, his eyes, his fear, and I faltered. She ran into the line of fire. The report later called her unidentified civilian casualty. The brass wrote it off as regrettable, but I carried it with me every damn day. I opened my eyes and found Sarah still staring at me, searching for something. "They're not wrong," I muttered, voice raw. "I am volatile. I did freeze, and I can't erase that." She shook her head. "That doesn't make you unfit. That makes you human. But they don't care about humanity, Daniel. They care about control. And Karen's giving them exactly what they need." I wanted to believe her, but the envelope on the counter said otherwise. Guardian Stability Assessment. In their eyes, I wasn't a father. I was a liability. The next day, Nate stormed in like a man on fire. His laptop was already open, code spilling across the screen. "You won't believe this," he said, voice sharp with urgency. "I pulled more from their servers. Safe Start isn't just cataloging families. They're drafting profiles, pre-clearance files. They're deciding months in advance who to target, who to monitor, who to remove." He spun the laptop toward us. Jason's file blinked on the screen, tagged with red markers: minor 714B, high instability risk, Guardian influence negative, and beneath that, my own Walker Daniel, volatile veteran. Surveillance authorized. Recommendation removal. Jason's small voice cut through the room. "They think I'm not safe because of you." The words hit harder than any fist. My son wasn't accusing me. He was repeating what the file told him to believe. But seeing it on his face, it hollowed me out. Sarah's hand shot to her mouth. She wasn't blaming me, not outright, but I saw the flicker of fear in her eyes. Fear not of me, but of what the system could twist me into. I slammed my fist on the table, startling them both. "This isn't about me. This isn't about mistakes I made overseas. This is about power. They're using our worst moments as excuses to dismantle families." Nate leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "You're right. But it doesn't change the fact they've already painted a target on your back." And Jason's placidness. Jason pushed away from the table, his chair scraping the floor. "So what now? Do I just wait for them to come again, hide under my bed while you fight?" His voice cracked. "I don't want to be the reason you go to war again." The silence after that was suffocating. I wanted to tell him he wasn't the reason, that none of this was his fault. But the truth was ugly. He was the reason. Not because he was weak, not because he was a burden, but because he was my son. And that made him valuable to them. I knelt beside him, gripping his shoulders. "Listen to me. You are not a risk. You are not unstable. You're my son. And they don't get to decide who you are." His lip trembled, but he didn't answer. He just turned away, eyes glistening, the weight of everything pressing down on him like it pressed on me. That night, Sarah found me in the garage. I was sitting on a metal chair, staring at my old service box, medals, discharge papers, things I'd tried to bury. She sat beside me without a word. After a long silence, she said quietly, "You can't fight shadows, Daniel. You'll burn yourself alive." I looked at her, voice low. "Then I'll burn their whole system down with me." Her eyes hardened. Not with fear, not with pity, but with something else. Resolve. The war I thought I'd left behind had followed me home. And this time the battlefield wasn't deserts or foreign cities. It was my street, my home, my family. And if they thought labeling me unstable would make me fold, they didn't understand the first rule of survival: you don't corner a man who's got nothing left to lose. The house no longer felt like a home. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the windows sent me on edge. Jason slept in, Fitz, his small frame curling into a knot under the blankets, and Sarah kept a baseball bat by the bed, as though that would be enough to keep monsters out. I knew better. Monsters didn't knock on the door or creep through the windows. Monsters wore tactical gear and carried clipboards stamped with fake authority, and they were coming back. I didn't have to wait long. It was just past 2 a.m. when I heard the shatter of glass. This time, they didn't bother with knocking. They came straight through the kitchen window shards, raining onto the tile. I was already moving bare feet silent against the floor, adrenaline replacing sleep. 3 shadows poured into the hallway. Their movements were crisp, more coordinated than the last group. Professionals. Jason's scream ripped through the silence. I sprinted up the stairs, heart slamming in my chest. The first man was already in his room, one gloved hand gripping Jason's wrist, the other clamping over his mouth. Jason kicked and thrashed, but the man dragged him toward the hall. I didn't hesitate. I slammed into him like a battering ram, my shoulder knocking him clear off his feet. Jason tumbled free, gasping, scrambling across the floor. The man hit the wall with a thud, but he was strong, rolling back up, knife flashing in his hand. The hallway exploded into violence. I caught his wrist twisted hard until bone popped, then drove my elbow into his throat. He gagged, dropped the knife, and collapsed. I barely had time to breathe before the second came at me. Bigger, meaner. He swung a baton, catching me across the ribs. Pain flared hot and sharp, but I pushed into it, grabbed the baton, and yanked him forward into a headbutt. My vision blurred from the impact, but he stumbled, giving me just enough space to hook his leg and drop him to the ground. Jason pressed against the wall, eyes wide with terror. Sarah screamed from the bedroom. The third man appeared, then calm, deliberate. He didn't rush. He advanced slowly, calculated, like he'd studied me. His gear was heavier, his stance tighter. This wasn't a hired thug. This was someone who had trained, maybe even the kind of man I used to be. He feinted a left jab, then drove his fist into my stomach. Air exploded from my lungs. He followed with another, but I caught his arm twisted and slammed him against the wall. The drywall cracked. He retaliated with a knee to my ribs. The sound of bone crunching filled the hallway. My knees nearly buckled, but I refused to fall, and then I saw it. On his chest rig, laminated in clear plastic, was Jason's photo, his school picture. My son's face smiling awkwardly in front of a blue backdrop. Rage detonated inside me. I grabbed the man by the rig, lifted and slammed him through the plaster. Jason screamed my name, but I didn't stop. My fists hammered down, 1, 2, 3, until his body went slack beneath me. My knuckles were raw, bleeding, but I didn't care. Dad Jason's voice cut through the haze. I froze breath, heaving, and looked up. Jason wasn't looking at the man on the floor. He was looking at me with fear. Not the fear of a child seeing a stranger, but the fear of a son seeing his father become something unrecognizable. I staggered back, chest heaving, forcing the monster inside me back into its cage. My hands shook, blood dripping onto the floor. Sarah was in the doorway, now clutching Jason to her chest. Her eyes darted from me to the men sprawled across the hallway to the hole in the wall and back again. They came for him, I said hoarsely. They had his picture, his name. They weren't here to scare us. They were here to take him. She didn't respond. She just tightened her grip on Jason, eyes wide with horror and disbelief. I pulled one of the men's phones from his belt, locked. I pressed his bloody thumb against the screen. It opened. The interface was cold, clinical. A schedule. Extraction 714. B. Guardian interference. Probable. Guardian. That was me. In their system, I wasn't Daniel Walker anymore. I was an obstacle. A variable to be managed. I shoved the phone into my pocket just as headlights washed over the windows. More cars. This time not black SUVs, police cruisers. Blue and red lights bathed the neighborhood. Radios crackled outside doors. Slammed boots pounded up the driveway. Sarah clutched Jason, her voice sharp with panic. What do we do? I stood in the hallway, fists clenched, blood dripping onto the carpet. My ribs screamed with every breath, but I forced my voice steady. We tell the truth, and we show them what they've been protecting. The front door burst open. Officers swarmed inside, weapons raised. I raised my hands slowly, stepping away from the unconscious men. They broke in, I said, voice steady but cold. They tried to take my son. Look at their gear. Look at their phones. One officer bent down, picked up the laminated photo from the man's vest. He froze, then glanced at Jason, who was trembling in Sarah's arms. The officer's jaw tightened. He believed it. Another officer pulled up the phone, scrolling through the files. His face drained of color. There's a manifest, he whispered. Safe Start Initiative. Guardian removal protocols. Phase 3 authorization. The room went silent. Jason looked at me, voice trembling. So, it's real. They really want to take me away. I knelt beside him, gripping his shoulders with steady hands. It's real, I said. But as long as I'm here, they don't win. He nodded, but his eyes stayed haunted. Because he'd seen me tonight, not just his father, but the soldier I'd spent years trying to bury. And for the first time, I wondered if Karen was right about one thing: maybe the system didn't need to destroy me. Maybe I was doing that myself. Still, I knew one truth the files didn't account for. They thought I was unstable, volatile, broken. They forgot the one thing every war had taught me. You don't steal a soldier's child and expect to walk away. The HOA board meetings were usually dull affairs. A handful of retirees arguing over Hedge Heights' late dues or whether Christmas lights violated the Uniform Aesthetics Clause. But not tonight. Tonight, the community center parking lot was overflowing. Cars lined both sides of the street, headlights cutting through the dusk as neighbors filed into the hall. Word had spread about the attempted abductions, about the manifest, about the photos taped to tactical vests. People who had never cared about HOA politics suddenly wanted front row seats. When I walked in, silence followed me. Conversations hushed. Heads turned. I felt their eyes trace the bruises on my jaw, the bandage on my arm, the stiffness in my walk. Jason sat beside Sarah in the front row, his hoodie pulled low, hands buried in his sleeves. He didn't want to be here, but he needed to see this. At the front of the room, the board sat like a suburban Supreme Court. 7 members behind a folding table draped with a beige cloth. At the center, perched like a queen bee, was Karen. She wore a pressed beige pantsuit, pearls gleaming under the fluorescent lights, lipstick perfect. And on her face was that same practiced smile, calm and confident, like she still controlled the script. "Mr. Walker," she cooed into the microphone, her voice carrying across the room. "We weren't expecting you tonight." I didn't answer. I walked straight to the podium, set a small device on the mic stand and pressed play. The room filled with Karen's voice. Cold-clipped, undeniable. "Proceed. Keep it clean. He won't fight." They all crack eventually. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was surgical. Every head turned toward her. Phones lifted, recording. A murmur rippled through the crowd like a storm building at sea. "That's from the body cam of one of the men who broke into my home," I said, my voice steady. "At 3 a.m., he zip-tied my son and prepared to drag him into a black SUV. And those were his orders. Her orders." Karen blinked once. Her smile faltered, but only for a fraction of a second. "That recording is clearly taken out of context," she said smoothly. "Which part?" I shot back. "Proceed, keep it clean. Or the part where you labeled my son an asset to be transferred." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A man in the back shouted, "My family got one of those letters too." Another woman stood clutching her phone, waving it. "They said my daughter was at risk. She's 7 years old." Karen raised her hands, palms outward, as though calming children. "Neighbors, please." "We mustn't be swayed by," I cut her off. "Don't bother, I have more." I pulled a flash drive from my pocket and slid it across the board's table. On that drive, you'll find internal emails, votes, funding, links to a shell company called Safe Start. 33 flagged homes in this neighborhood alone. Dozens of children profiled, cataloged, and marked. Every one of you sitting here signed off on it. The vice chair, a gray-haired man named Dennis, tried to interject. "Mr. Walker, we are not here to litigate conspiracy theories," then resign, I snapped. "Because this isn't theory, it's data. Your signatures are on the authorizations." He shut up. Karen's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. "This man has a history of volatility," she said, turning to the crowd, her voice dripping with false concern. "He is unstable, and his trauma makes him dangerous. That's why the system flagged him. That's why I pressed play again. Accelerate phase 3. Frame it as neighborhood safety. No one questions anything if you say the word child." Karen's voice filled the hall once more, undeniable, surgical. The crowd erupted. Shouts, boos, voices rising like a wave. An old man in a military jacket stood, his voice trembling with fury. "My granddaughter was 6 years old when you sent one of those letters, Karen." 6. Another woman, pink cardigan, trembling on her shoulders, shouted. I second his motion. A third stood, a fourth. Suddenly the entire hall was alive, neighbors shouting, recording, standing together. Karen's mask cracked. She stood abruptly, her pearl necklace catching the light, her eyes boring into mine. Not with fear, with hate. "You're not saving your son, Daniel," she hissed. "You're turning him into you." The words cut deeper than I expected, because I knew there was some truth in them. Jason had seen me fight like an animal. He had seen blood on my fists, rage in my eyes. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was passing my demons on to him. But before the thought could root itself, the board voted. In a storm of raised hands and shouted demands, Karen was suspended from her position. Dennis Withers, the vice chair, resigned on the spot. An emergency audit was ordered. Safe Start's funding was frozen pending investigation. For the first time in weeks, I felt like the tide had turned. We walked out into the parking lot as the crowd still buzzed inside. The night air was cool, almost sweet. Jason climbed into the back seat, pulling his hoodie tighter. Sarah leaned against the car, arms folded. She looked at me, not with relief, not with triumph, but with exhaustion. "Is it over?" she asked softly. I looked at Jason, then back at her. Number? Not even close. Because even as neighbors shouted Karen's name inside, even as the board collapsed under the weight of its own corruption, I felt my phone vibrate. An unknown number. I answered. Silence on the other end. Then a voice low and calm. Phase 4 wasn't hers to approve. A pause. "We don't clean up messes, Mr. Walker. We bury them." The line went dead. I stood in the parking lot, the phone still pressed to my ear, staring at the stars above. For a moment, I saw Jason's reflection in the car window, his wide eyes watching me, searching for answers. I had none. Not yet. But I knew one thing. Karen was never the true enemy. She was just the bait. And whoever was pulling the strings had just declared war. The call still echoed in my skull the next morning. "We don't clean up messes. We bury them." Those words didn't come from Karen or some HOA enforcer with a clipboard. That voice belonged to someone higher, colder, detached from the neighborhood squabbles. Karen had been nothing more than a pawn. A dangerous pawn, yes, but a pawn nonetheless. I drove 2 towns over to a warehouse Nate had been fortifying into what he jokingly called a digital war room. It was no joke to me. Inside were humming servers, blackout curtains, and rows of monitors glowing with stolen data. Jason sat at a corner desk, hood up, silent, while Sarah brewed stale coffee just to keep her hands busy. Nate was hunched over his laptop, his fingers hammering keys with manic urgency. "Bad news," he said before I even closed the door. "SafeStart isn't just suspended. They're restructuring. New names, new shell companies, new funding. They're already trying to bury the evidence." I clenched my fists. "Then we bury them first." Nate's smirk was thin. "Funny you say that. Because I found something." He spun the laptop toward me. On the screen was a map of the state littered with red dots. Each dot represented a flagged neighborhood. And each neighborhood had its own minor assets listed. Kids. Dozens of them. Jason wasn't unique. He was a blueprint. Sarah's voice shook. "So this wasn't just about us," No, Nate said. "We were one test case. There are dozens more. Phase 5 is coming, a national rollout. And they've got a logistics hub in Phoenix they call the core. That's where all this feeds back." Jason lifted his head finally, his voice quiet but steady. "Then we shut it down." I looked at him, my son, 14, exhausted, bruised but still standing. He had seen too much, more than I ever wanted for him. But the fire in his eyes wasn't fear anymore. It was defiance. That night we moved. The warehouse became our staging ground. Nate worked the digital angles, mapping entry points, hacking security protocols, finding weaknesses in the core's network. Sarah organized supplies, flash drives, comm gear, even first aid kits. And Jason, he watched. He listened. And when I tried to push him away, telling him this wasn't his fight, he shook his head. "You said I was their blueprint," he told me. "Then let me be the one who breaks it." I couldn't argue. Not anymore. We left at 2 a.m. A van, dark and nondescript, carrying everything we had. Nate guided us through side streets, avoiding traffic cameras. Jason sat with the drives clutched in his lap, his knuckles white. Sarah rested a hand on his shoulder, though her eyes were locked forward, jaw tight. The core wasn't much to look at from the outside. A bland concrete structure, labeled as a disaster response facility, hidden in plain sight. But as we descended through a maintenance shaft, the truth revealed itself. White walls, black glass, humming servers that seemed to breathe. It wasn't just a facility, it was a cathedral of control. We breached the server chamber at 311. Rows upon rows of black towers blinked with red lights, each one storing the lives of families reduced to data points. Jason's face appeared on one monitor, his profile flashing with words that made my blood boil. Asset 714B. Adaptive compliance model. Success rate 93%. They weren't just watching him, Nate whispered. They were training him. Rage surged through me. I smashed the terminal with my fist sparks flying. "Copy everything," I barked. Nate's fingers flew. The drives filled with data, emails, schematics, risk models. But then the alarms blared. Red lights flashed. Guards swarmed from the West Hall, rifles raised. We fought like demons. Sarah disarmed one with a fire extinguisher to the skull. I dropped another with a chokehold that left him gasping. Jason ducked low, clutching the drives, refusing to let go, even when bullets ricocheted off the walls. 80% copied, Nate shouted. "That's enough. We go live now." He hit execute. The files spread like wildfire, darknet drops, whistleblower servers, encrypted university vaults. Within minutes, the Core's secrets were no longer secrets. But the system wasn't going to let us walk out. A heavy trained enforcer cut us off in the corridor. He was bigger than me, faster, every move precise. He caught me in a grapple forearm, crushing my windpipe. Spots danced in my vision. I was seconds from blacking out when Sarah appeared, swinging a metal rod into the back of his skull. He collapsed, and I sucked in air like it was fire. We ran. Explosions rocked the shaft as Nate's timed charges detonated, collapsing the servers behind us. By the time we reached the van, the Core was burning from the inside out. Jason sat in the back, clutching the